In this video I'm going to show you the steps involved in completing your Analysed Cashbook, finding your balance and then opening up your ledger accounts. Cashbook questions can be quite tricky, but once you've got the general concept on how to complete a cashbook, you'll be able to complete any question you might get. The cashbook questions are usually where you have to help a business prepare its account for a certain month. So you'll get usually text like you see on the top left here. There's only key bits of information we need out of this text, so it's a really good habit to get into if you can highlight the key bits of information such as dates, amounts, and was it a debit or a credit. Pulling this information out of the text will really help you build a picture of the company's finances. So I've taken all the information out and put it into the right hand side, so now I know exactly what information I have to put into the cashbook. It's important to ask yourself, is it a debit or a credit before posting anything to the cashbook, just so you are sure you're putting it into the correct side. We'll start by bringing down our balance from the previous month to open up this month's cashbook. We can see from the text that we highlighted that the opening balance for the month of July is €2,500. Our opening balance is a debit, so we're going to add it into our left hand side and start with our date. So it's the 1st of July. Details then, what is it? It's a balance, and it's a balance brought down from the previous month. Then the amount is then 2,500 and that goes into the bank column. And that's our first cashbook. Then next on our list is €19,000 of sales plus 9% VAT. Our sales is money we've received, so again this is going to go in on the debit side. Again we're going to start with our date, the 25th of the 7th, give some details about it, it's cash sales, and enter in €19,000 into the sales column. This transaction included VAT, so once you find out what 9% is of 19,000, put it into the VAT column. It's important to remember here that your sales and VAT are entered separately. Once you know the total of the two, your sales and your VAT, you add it into the bank. So here we can see it's 20,710 with our sales and VAT added together. Next up is materials bought on the 5th of July for 8,800 plus 9% VAT. This is money we paid out because we purchased the materials, so it's going into our credit side. We'll start with our date, details, and we'll add our €8,800 into our purchase column. Again, like on our last entry, this transaction is subject to 9% VAT. We'll follow the same steps we did before and get 9% of €8,800 this time, and we'll enter this into the VAT column. Now we're going to add our VAT amount and our purchase amount together, which will give us a total of 9,592, and this goes into the bank column. Next up is the 11th of July, and that was for €580 electricity bill, which is paid out, so it's going on to our credit side. So we'll start off by putting in our date and some details about it. We'll put the amount of €580 into our bank column, and we'll look across at the other columns and we see there's one for light and heat. So we're going to put our €580 into there as well. We're over halfway there, and next up is July 15th, where €3,800 was spent on buying a coffee machine. So that was something that was bought, so it's going into the credit side. So we're going to start with our date, our details about it then, it was a coffee machine. And we're going to be entering €3,800 into our bank column. And then we're going to have a look across at the other columns, and we see an equipment column, so €3,800 is also going to go in there. So our next transaction we can see is July 27th, where €10,000 of a grant was received. The key word here is received, and that means we're getting the money, so it's going into the debit side of the cashbook. We're going to start, as we always do, with putting in our date, add some details about it, and then into the bank column goes 10,000. From here then we have a look across at the other columns and see does it fit into any of them. And we see there's a grant column, so that's ideal, and we're going to put our 10,000 into there as well. July 28th we paid wages totaling 3,140. So we paid it, so it's going on to the credit side, so we're going to start with putting in our date, some details about it, and into the bank column goes 3,140. We're going to have a look over to the right hand side and we can see there's a wages column, so we're going to put our 3,140 in there as well. The next step to do is add up the sales, VAT and grant on your debit side and the purchases, VAT, wages, equipment and light and heat on the credit side. Once you've that done, put the totals into the columns you see highlighted, and that should give you the total values for those accounts for the month of July. Your next step is to add up the bank column on the debit side and the credit side. Just make a note of both values because you don't want to enter them just yet. So what you want to do here is whatever value is greater is the value that you want to enter. So we see here we have 33,210 on the debit side and 17,112 on the credit side. We can see now that 33,210 is the greater of the two numbers, so that is the number we're going to enter into both sides, the debit and the credit. This is entered into both sides as this allows us to balance the books. So what we're left with now is a figure that we need to find, which is the balance carried down. We find the balance carried down by subtracting the larger amount by the smaller amount. So 33,210 minus 17,112 will give us our balance carried down for the month of July, which is €16,098. Our final step now to complete this cash book is take that same balance, the balance carried down of 16,098, taking that same balance over to the debit side, and that will be our balance brought down to the next month. So we're going to enter the 1st of the 8th, 1st of August, and it's a balance brought down, and that's how we balance our books in the cash book. Now that we have our Analysed Cashbook complete for July, we have to open up our individual accounts in the general ledger. We're going to be using the figures that we calculated in our Analysed Cashbook for each account, and these are the figures that we're going to be taking over to the general ledger. One very important thing to note here is if a transaction is in the debit side of the Analysed Cashbook, it must be posted to the credit side of the general ledger. And if it's in the credit side of the Analysed Cashbook, it must go into the debit side of the general ledger. So again, we're starting with our figures that you see highlighted here, and we're going to open up individual accounts for each of those. We'll start with our sales account in the Analysed Cashbook, and we can see that is €19,000. So we're going to come over to our general ledger and open up a sales account. So we're going to write in sales account. So the sales is on the debit side of the cash book, so we know now that in the ledger it's going to be switching sides, so it's going to the credit side. So we'll start by writing in our date, our details and our total amount, 19,000, and again we're getting that figure from our Analysed Cashbook. Next up is the purchase account, so we're going to open up our purchase account on our general ledger. We see that our purchase account in the cash book is on the credit side, so we know now that it's going into the debit side, it's switching sides in the general ledger. We'll start by writing in our last day of the month, the 31st of the 7th, and our total amount then, which is 8,800 for purchases in July. Next up is our equipment account, and our equipment account is in the credit side of our cash book, so it's transferring sides when it's going into the ledger, so it's going into the debit side. So we'll add in the last day of the month, the 31st of the 7th, give some details about it, and then the amount of 3,800. Next up now we have our lighting and heat account. So in the cash book it's in the credit, so it's transferring sides when it goes into the ledger, so it's going into the debit side of the ledger. We'll start with writing our date, our details and our amount of €580 into our debit side. Up next is our grant account, and in the cash book the grant is in the debit side, so that means it must be entered into the credit side of the ledger. We'll start by entering our date, the last day of the month, 31st to 7th, details and then the amount of €10,000. Up next is our wages account, and in our cash book our wages is in the credit, so that means in the ledger it's going to be entered into the debit side. As we did with our other entries, we're going to enter in our date, details and our total of 3,140. We are now on to our last entry into our ledger, and that is going to be our VAT account. We can see from our cash book that the VAT account is actually in the debit and the credit side. So the same rules apply. When you see the VAT in the debit side, it's going to be in the credit side of the ledger, and in the credit side of the cash book, it's going to be in the debit side of the ledger. We're going to take our VAT purchases from our credit side of our Analysed Cashbook, and we're going to be posting them to our debit side of our general ledger. So again, they're switching sides. Then on our debit side of our cash book, there is VAT sales. So we're going to be posting those to the credit side of our general ledger. Once we have that done, we see there is 792 in our VAT account in our debit side and 1710 in our credit side. We see now that there's two figures in our VAT columns. There are 792 on the debit side and 1710 on the credit side. To help us find the balance now, we are going to put the larger amount of the two sums into both the debit and the credit side. So 1710 goes into both sides. What we do here to help us find our balance carried down on our debit side is we take the smaller number away from the larger number. So we're taking 792 away from 1710. This leaves us with a balance carried down of €908 on our debit side. The final step now to balance our books is bring that figure of 918, your balance carried down, bring that down to the credit side, and that will be our balance brought down to the next month, so it's the 1st of the 8th. And folks, that is how you complete an Analysed Cashbook and post it to the general ledger. Once you get your head around the concept of completing the cashbook and posting it to the general ledger, you'll have no problems with it. So it's important to get your Analysed Cashbook correct first before you move on to your general ledger, because those are the figures that you are taking into the ledger, so it's important they are correct. Hopefully this video was helpful, and you can use this as a study resource when you're studying for the cashbook or general ledger question.